I heard some news about Tony and Gary that they're on their way to the hospital, and God, pray right now that you be with them. God, your presence there. Thank you for the way you just hold us all, and we love you. Amen. Huh, Gil. I was just praying, God, help Gil to get here. Hallelujah. I always tell Gil he's like Kramer, right? Like just the way you kind of come into the room, like whoosh. We love you. Right, exactly. Hey, if you come in late, it's free game, right? Oh, that's just my love for this man right here. All right, Acts 19 today as we continue on. Why are we reading through the book of Acts? Well, this is scripture. Obviously, that matters alone. But something to me about Acts that is so great is really, in so many ways, we're studying just how the church is the church. What are we here to do? How do we behave as a church? How do we live into the commission that God gave us? That Acts still continues to be the assignment for us today. But sometimes when we go back and read it in context, we might ask ourselves, okay, is this still relevant, right? That as the gospel is going into Greece now, you realize that the subject often being addressed is going to have to do right on the surface with where they're at culturally. And that means, in Greece, idolatry. And so today we're going to talk about idolatry. Now, you're thinking to yourself, okay, but is this really the same world that we're talking about? And this is the thing that I think is so interesting. It is so often when we come to the surface of Scripture, we see a different world. But when you get just beneath the surface, you realize almost painfully that nothing's changed. That people just are people. And that the issues that they were facing in Ephesus 2,000 years ago look very much like the issues that we actually are facing today. I was going to title this sermon, Idolatry, the Thing Behind the Thing. Marcia just reminded me, she's like, in 2015 you taught a sermon called The Thing Behind the Thing. And I was like, who remembers that? Not even I, apparently, but thank you for that accountability. So this is maybe a follow-up to that, apparently subconsciously. So anyway, but the thing behind the thing, to me, is where we find, here is what is really going on. And I think this so often in our lives, there's the surface of things, but the matters of the heart tend to be in the depths. As Proverbs says, the wise person is going to plumb the depths of the heart and draw those things out. So hopefully for all of us today, this is an opportunity for us to look just a little bit deeper at what's really going on. Acts 19, we're going to read the last part of it, verses 23 through 41, titled here, The Riot in Ephesus. About that time, there arose a great disturbance about the way, which is the church's name for themselves. Christian was kind of like the outward description, like, the little Christ. But the church called themselves the way. And a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together along with the workers in related trades and said, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people did not even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people, but when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, "Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven? Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, though they have neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there's anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we are in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there's no reason for it." After he said this, he dismissed the assembly. This is the word of the Lord. It's a fascinating story, isn't it? And you know, it would be nice to look back on this and think this sort of behavior was unusual at the time, and what would that be like? And I think for all of us, you just go, well, just turn on the news. This sort of energy, this commotion, and what's going on here? Well, you know, we've talked about how in Thessalonica, when Paul was coming there, the accusation was, oh, this is the guy that's turning the world upside down, right? He's the guy that's upending the systems, that the sort of way that we see the world, understand the world, and function. He's undermining all of that. He's asking almost like the questions we've all agreed not to ask ourselves. And Paul is coming in and he's putting his finger on the thing, and clearly he's onto something, because what you see is this outpouring of emotional response. We think we're defending this sort of system, right? This is about Artemis. And what we see is this is not about Artemis. In fact, the person pointing this out isn't even a Christian, right? It's interesting that we see this from time to time in Scripture, where you have these kind of sermons that are presented by somebody who's not a believer. Here we see the city clerk going, I don't think these people are doing what you're accusing them of doing. So in his words, calm down. You guys calm down. In this emotional turmoil, I think that we get this little window into the human condition. And the truth is that you see just how emotional all of us are. I like the way, and you've heard me say this before, but Brene Brown says, we're not thinking creatures that have emotions. We're emotional creatures that have thoughts. And oftentimes, this is why the thing behind the thing is like the massive thing, that all of our attention is on our thoughts. That's what captures our focus, our mind. We see this little argument here, and what's behind it all, the energy behind it, is all emotion, all heart. It's stirred up by things deeper sometimes than we even realize, things in our subconscious, worries and fears. In this chapter, we see the city clerk stepping forth and saying, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash here. And I appreciate that. I think this is human wisdom, right? And human wisdom is a real thing. That too often in these things, the temperature rises. I like how sometimes people will describe this as like the red zone versus the blue zone. Have you heard those terms? That the red zone, parenting-wise, we would call that being flooded. That so often we're trying to have these conversations when emotions are high. I think that we as parents like to think of that as a description of our kids, when in fact, oftentimes as parents, we are the ones that are flooded. We are the ones in the red zone trying to act as if we're in the blue zone. And this way of like coming back to a place of like really paying attention, this is clearly good advice in this case. You see, as Luke is describing this, he's like, they're chanting over and over, Artemis is for the Ephesians, for literally 2 hours, right? You see him like checking his watch and like, wow, they're still going, right? There's this intensity here. I love how it's even saying, a lot of the people didn't even know why they were there. They're just there chanting, and this is how things tend to go. But Luke helps us understand really what's going on behind the scenes, right? And this whole discussion early on from Demetrius is interesting. What is this about? Is this about Artemis? Well, no, it's really about money. He's going, this message Paul is teaching is cutting into the economics of this city. And this Ephesus is a city that's built around a shrine, that this temple to Artemis was like one of the wonders of the world at the time. As we talked about, Paul went to Athens and he was like overwhelmed with the number of idols that are there. And Ephesus would be a similar situation, that Artemis would be the whole identity of the people there. And they hear the implication of what Paul is preaching. He's teaching this message saying these gods, these idols are not actually gods. This is the message that cuts right to the heart of their whole way of understanding their life, understanding their livelihood, understanding their personal value. I've heard this statistic, and I don't know for sure if it's true, but that all of us can question about 5% of our beliefs at any one time. When you get beyond that, you go into the red, right? This belief that sort of is holding and propping up everything else. Sometimes we don't even really know what those things are until we get emotional. I remember this one time, I was a part of Campus Crusade when I was doing my undergrad, and so what we would do is we would just go share our faith on campus, and so man, I did that probably hundreds of times. But there's one that I remember where I was talking to this girl. She was an international student. And as I was talking about faith, the little track that I would use kind of brings you to this decision. Do you want the circle on the left or the circle on the right? And I just remember her saying to me, do you have any idea what you're asking me to do? And I was thinking, I'm not sure I do. Like, all of a sudden I was like looking at her and she was going, this affects everything. Right? And I was like, no, we're just talking about, like, don't you want to go to heaven? And she was like, the implications of what you're talking about are massive. And in some ways for myself, I thought, I'm learning something here. I think for me that this has always been a sort of piece of the puzzle or a piece of the pie when really she's going, this kind of affects the whole pie. There's a sociologist named Peter Berger, and he describes these things like we might use a term like a worldview. He talks about it as a sacred canopy, which is such an interesting term, but he's going, all of us sort of inevitably come up with a sacred canopy, a way of seeing the world. But this message that Paul is preaching is poking holes in the sacred canopy. The whole structure around idols that helps them make sense out of their vocation, out of their livelihood, even out of their value. And when you start poking holes in something like that, people get emotional. Paul is kind of addressing throughout Acts so far 3 different sort of canopies that exist. You could kind of put each of his sermons into these kind of one of 3, although sometimes they overlap. He often goes to the synagogue, and there he's going to teach to the Jewish people that Jesus is the culmination of your story. It's what you have been waiting for all along, that the whole Old Testament is about preparing our hearts for the Messiah, and he's come. When when Paul talks to Romans, he's going to say, you have this phrase, Caesar is Lord. I'm telling you, Jesus is Lord. addressing the political and their tendency to want to turn their leader, their emperor, into the divine. Paul is saying that the gospel is directly countering the divinity of Caesar and replacing that lordship with Christ. But to the Greeks, he talks about idols again and again. When the gospel comes in, what it is going to confront is their idolatry. And with this, he ends up confronting their whole canopy, their whole way of seeing and making sense out of their lives. He just said this in Athens just a few chapters ago. He says, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. Gods made by human hands are no gods at all. Demetrius is like, yeah, but we receive a pretty good income from this. And you're like, okay, this is what this is actually about. It's end of the year. It's the time for commencement speeches, and probably many of you have listened. Have you listened to David Foster Wallace's Kenyan speech? How many people have listened to, This Is Water? Okay, it's so good. And he is just a brilliant writer who tragically died young. But in this commencement speech, he's the guy who starts with that joke about the fish, right? Here's the old fish swimming by, and the fish says to the two young fish, hey boys, how's the water? And one of the young fish looks to the other and goes, what's water? And he's talking about this world that we swim in, the things that we take for granted, right? The things that we just assume. But he has this line in there that to me feels like so poignant to what we're reading today. He says this, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. Again, this is somebody who is pretty much non-spiritual in that sense. Noticing the water is this worship that ends up in almost every form that it takes, turning into some form of self-worship that consumes us, that enslaves us. He says this just a little bit later, if you worship money and things, if they are where you tap meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. Just for fun, and Greg already warned me that you're not going to be able to see this. I didn't make this little chart. I had ChatGPT do it. But I just said, you can look at this later. I just said, give me a list of all the Roman gods. Tell me the value that they represented. And what might be the possible modern equivalent today. So interesting. Artemis, fertility. Ultimate concern is security and abundance. Possible modern equivalent, financial security, career success, lifestyle. Zeus, power and authority, meaning control and dominance. Possible equivalent, political influence, status, leadership, winning. That doesn't apply, right? Athena, wisdom, strategy, intelligence, competence, being right, which leads to education, expertise, intellectual superiority, certainty. You look down this list, culture wars, tribalism, romantic fulfillment, networking, entertainment, consumerism, comfort, predictability, performance, culture, metrics, recognition, blah, 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 blah. There's nothing new under the sun, right? And we might look at these sort of idolatrous systems and be like, well, at least we're not so stupid enough to go worship a statue. And you're like, Well, okay. All of these things might have been sort of on the surface, creating a structure that you're right, we maybe in some respects have moved on from, some respects we haven't moved on from. It's amazing how those things kind of cycle themselves through, right? That all of a sudden everybody's reading tarot cards again or whatever it is, zodiac stuff. These things sort of naturally come back and become in fashion. But really, the thing is not the thing. The statue is not the thing. But the attachment underneath it, this is the thing. This is the heart. Interestingly enough, if you look Old Testament-wise at idolatry, the closest comparison that it makes in the Old Testament scriptures is with adultery. That it's an unfaithfulness of heart. It's a disordered affection. And that this really is what the gospel is about. It's saying that you're loving the wrong thing. And when you do that, not only does that thing become this sort of idol, but it enslaves you to it. Honestly, I think that there can even be a Christian version of the same thing if we're not careful. Why? Because this is what the heart does. This is what David Foster Wallace is getting at, is he's saying, we worship, and whether we want to admit it or not, that self-worship is constantly competing for the throne, constantly sneaking its way back up there. That we can surrender our lives only to find ourselves going right back into that place of control again and again and again. So what does the gospel do? Well, it comes right towards that thing that we're protecting. That's kind of what the riot is, right? The riot is this way of protecting something that really in the end is an underlying fear or worry. There's a sort of panic or energy to this. I always think that underlying thing, that belief that's threatened, is like the bottom piece of a Jenga tower, right? And you've got the whole tower, and then you've got that one piece at the bottom that's left, and the whole thing's wobbling, right? And the question that's asked is like bumping the table, and we're like, don't bump the table, right? Don't knock the tower over. I think sometimes God's like, let's rock this, right? In some ways, like going, let's let the tower fall. Because so often, the thing that we're so afraid of, the thing that we're protecting, isn't something that we need to be worried about. It's true, if it's left up to us, well, then we better clutch. But if it really is true that God is saying, you can trust me with that thing that you're so worried about, you can trust me. It's almost like our fingers have to be pried open for us to learn how to trust. The gospel is iconoclastic. It goes and it finds our icons and breaks them. This thing, sometimes it does it gently, sometimes the tables get turned over. But where we get tied to these things, God lovingly comes and finds those things and strips them of the power that they seem to possess, exposes them for the weaknesses underneath it. But all done with that heart of wanting to set our hearts free, maybe even free from ourselves. It was John Calvin that described the heart as a perpetual idol factory, right? That we're just always making them and pumping them out, that we're like, it's just our default setting. Which is part of why we build a rhythm in our lives of confession, a rhythm in our lives of exposing that tendency in ourselves, coming back to true north. I have this watch that's like an automatic, which means that it just will kind of self-wind, which is like really nice, right? It's always winding itself, but if I'm totally honest, it loses time. Like a little bit each day. And so there's like a maintenance of the watch where you're kind of like each day you like readjust. If I don't do that, pretty soon I'm like 10 minutes late to everything. I'm already 10 minutes late, so 20 minutes late to everything. This way of like making micro adjustments to this to keep ourselves on track. This is part of the work that we do. It's part of the work that God is doing in us. And too often we focus on the things even about our faith that have a way of making us look good. I remember years ago there's this guy, Peter Rollins, who wrote like these new parables. And he tells this great one. I've used it before, but bear with me. It's about somebody who's on trial for being a Christian. And the person who's on trial is like, God, give me the courage to just stand up for my faith. And as he does, and he's standing before the judge says, not guilty. And the person is like, all of a sudden goes from like fear to like offense. Like, not guilty. Just look at my life. Look at my Bible's out. Look at the books I'm reading. Look at the music that I listen to. And the court's like, oh, you can do that. Like, we don't care, right? He says, this is Peter Rollins now. He says, the court's indifferent toward your Bible reading and church attendance. It's no concern for worship with words and pen. Continue to develop your theology and use it to paint pictures of love. We have no interest in such armchair artists who spend their time creating images of a better world. We exist only for those who would lay down that brush and their life in a Christ-like endeavor to create it. So until you live as Christ and his followers, until you challenge this system and become a thorn in our side, until you die to yourself and offer your body to the flames, until then, my friend, you're no enemy of ours. Now, he's writing provocatively there. Certainly, this isn't permission to just go out and be offensive. Please don't take it that way. But I think what he's saying is when we talk about living our life in a certain way and dying to self, there's our own offense, and then there's the effect that that's going to have on others. And that effect is often conviction. It's also the light of truth that's exposing systems that are too small. And the way I think that we do this is by bringing our lives into submission to this. A theologian that I like, his name's Paul Tillich. He talks about faith as this idea of ultimate concern. What is the ultimate concern in your life? And the second that becomes yourself, the whole system gets wonky. But when Christ is that ultimate concern, this is what brings alignment. This is what brings stability. This is what brings everything into control. True faith is this sense of trust and surrender to allow God to be first, even when that costs us something. So that's my question for you today. What is your ultimate concern? What is that thing? Except that I think sometimes that's the wrong question to ask ourselves because we all know the right answer. I'm like, what is the thing that gives your life meaning? You're like, Jesus. Ding. So sometimes I think to get at the ultimate concern, what we have to do is come in like slant at it. We almost need a different question. Like, what most occupies your thoughts? What is the thing that you worry about? What is that thing that determines your peace? What in your life are you most afraid to lose? What is it that I'm willing to sacrifice for? Tim Keller defines an idol as anything that becomes so central to your life that if you lose it, life feels hardly worth living. It's kind of another way of rephrasing Tillich's idea. Ultimate concern. What is that thing that if you lost it, your life wouldn't be worth living? That's the thing that we end up building our life around. That's the thing that creates our little sacred canopy. That's the thing that God is constantly wanting to pull down. And again, here's the thing, idols, we might look at idols and think, okay, well, those are clearly bad things competing with God. So that's clear. But the truth is, most of the idols in our life, what's lurking beneath that thing is something good, which is where it gets confusing. That to live a life of responsibility, to live a life of service, these are virtuous things until we make them the ultimate thing. I like how C.S. Lewis, when he's talking about virtue, he's saying, even the thing most pure, like if he was to talk about what is the most pure intent, he would say, it's a mother with her child. And yet even that, when made an ultimate thing, can become needy and controlling and all of that, right? You're like, even the most pure virtue, when it becomes the ultimate, gets twisted. This is Lewis's whole thing that he's exploring in the Screw Tape Letters, right? Where he's like, the devil has not created any vice. There's no thing the devil has created. All he's done is taken good things and twisted them, bent them. Things like success and security and approval and comfort, control, family, ministry, being right. Like all of these things are like not bad things. It's just they can easily become idols when they become the thing. Lewis says, no natural feelings are high or low, holy or unholy in themselves. They are all holy when God's hand is on the rein. They all go bad when they set up on their own and make themselves into false gods. This sort of way of ordering our lives is a constant work. It requires a sort of constant vigilance, not to become paranoid over, but to become self-accusatory in a good way, to be cautious or suspicious of ourselves. Is this slowly becoming too important? I think for myself, I think for me, I've said this before, but during COVID, I was like, every day was so hard, right? And the best part of my day, I'd finish the day and I would sit down in my leather chair and I would have a glass of wine and I would be like, made it. It was like my reward. And you're like, oh yeah, that's fine, like, right? Like occasionally, and I'd be like, no, kind of every day. That was my reward. I remember listening to Brene, and Brene was like, yeah, that's called a take the edge off-aholic. And you're like, slowly it becomes like the thing, right? Like you're sort of situating your day around this reality of like, if I could just make it to here and then, everything's okay. And how you attach yourself to that after a while. It sort of becomes the motivation. And then things start shifting around that, right? And you're like, gosh, I'm sort of staying up too late and my sleep is bad and all of these things around this idea. And your life just starts to get smaller because of it. And I think that this is the way so often sin is, right? It's that attachment underneath. It's giving away power to something else. It's causing our hearts to shrink. It's causing our affections to change. And this is the thing, God is going to go like, hey, time to be done with that. Right? Time to break that idol. So often it requires something a little bit more dramatic to let go of. I've often said this is why Lent is such a gift, that season of Lent, where you put aside something that maybe you're going isn't wrong per se, it's just become too important. So I'm going to put that aside for 40 days to gain some freedom from that thing. This way of ordering our lives, I feel like this is the work we are going to be doing for the rest of our time on earth. This is the work that God has begun and he's promised to be faithful to complete. But it takes ongoing work and maintenance. I love the story of Jesus with Mary and Martha. And in Luke 10, it says, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to the village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things. But few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better and will not be taken away from her. In there, I think sometimes we feel like Martha's gifts are being demeaned, but I don't think they are. What he's talking about is like all of these things that you are worried about. This little sacred canopy that Martha has, it's probably tied to her whole sense of value. She probably is the one that at the end of the night, people are like, where's Martha? Martha, come out here. Like, Martha, look at this beautiful party that she's done. And she's like, oh, psh, right? And inside she's like, my value, this is why I'm important. This is why I matter. And Jesus is like, this is not why you matter. This is a beautiful party. This is not why you matter. Few things are needed. In fact, only one. And I think for all of us, this becomes the gift for us. Is when we pull this alignment back, all of a sudden we realize that this actually costs very little to follow Jesus. In fact, it comes with an enormous amount of freedom to enjoy things the right amount and no further. In Matthew 6, Jesus says, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat or what shall we drink? What shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things. And your heavenly Father knows you need them, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. First things and second things. This is what he's talking about. St. Augustine says to have a well-ordered heart is to love the right thing in the right degree, in the right way, and with the right kind of love. And this is what Jesus is trying to teach us how to do, how to love rightly. The right thing in the right degree, in the right way, with the right kind of love. So that heart, right, who we are at our core, is just thriving and abundant and healthy. Not tied to these things that are hurting us. And so often these idols we give up only to have God give them back to us. Some he doesn't. I was thinking this would be okay to say. For Evelyn, who just recently passed away, she was like 43 years sober. And I remember talking about heaven with her, and she's like, in heaven, I'm going to drink wine. You're like, that a girl, right? She's like, not in this lifetime. And that was her journey, right? She was like, that's off the table. That will always be an idol in this lifetime. That there's a freedom that's coming that eventually will rectify all of that. But so often what Jesus is doing is wanting to get us to be able to love the right things in the right way to the right degree. But to do this requires restraint, which for us feels like the opposite of freedom. I just finished up this book that I've been talking to you guys about by Abraham Heschel called God's Pursuit of Man. But he talks about the Sabbath, and you're like, oh, the Sabbath is this day of freedom. We're like, no, the Sabbath is the day where you don't get to do all of these things. And he's like, no. It's like laying aside all of these things and just experiencing the freedom and the beauty of being with God. But it takes some inner work, doesn't it, to lay those things down? So often we have this picture of relaxation only when we get there. We just cannot. We worry and we spin. This is the enslavement. And God's saying, I want to set you free from this. Here's a little Heschel for you. He says, to be a Jew, and realize this, that like even as Paul's teaching, Jesus is the completion of that assignment. He says, to be a Jew is to renounce allegiance to false gods, to be sensitive to God's infinite stake in every finite situation, to bear witness to his presence in the hours of his concealment. He's such a good writer. Read that again. To bear witness to his presence in the hours of his concealment, to remember that the world is unredeemed. We are born to be an answer to his question. Our way is either a pilgrimage or a flight. We are chosen to remain free of infatuation with worldly triumphs, to retain independence of hysteria and deceptive glories, never to surrender to splendor, even at the price of remaining strangers to fashion. There's the cost, right? But what is on the other side of that? A heart that is free, not running, not worried, not filled with anxiety. A heart that's free to love the right things for the right reasons. And Hebrews 12:2 says, fix your eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. And this is the beauty that Jesus models this as he goes to the cross, that the Christian life is about laying these things down, but ultimately this realization that whoever loses his life will gain it. Paul's not wasting his time attacking Artemis. He's just like, this whole system is too small. And this is, to me, the joy of the gospel. The good news is that when that canopy comes down, you're like, oh, there it is. There's the truth. And honestly, I've told you this before, but I've had moments in my life where I feel like God has led me right into my fear. Right into the thing that I'm so desperately trying to prevent. Like, there's got to be a way around this. And God's like, this is where we're going, Jeff. To the point, and it sounds so like overly dramatic, and maybe it is, but I remember thinking, if this happens, I think I'll just die. Only to find myself in that situation there, at first thinking this is a nightmare, and then going, no, this is really happening, and then going, I'm okay. That reassurance, sometimes we have to just be shown. If it was up to me, I would spend all my time in green pastures beside still waters. But often God is going to say, we're going to go down to the valley of the shadow of death. Because even there, you need fear no evil. Why? I'm with you. And that's the truth. Even when our eyes are not fixed on Jesus, he is there with us, fixed on us. That what Jesus wants is that intimacy and that trust. I'm with you. And that's the thing. It's there in those spaces when that canopy comes down where all of a sudden there's revelation. We're able to transcend ourselves based on this beauty that God is inviting us to, this greater reality. And this is why it's called the gospel. This thing that can at first seem so threatening ends up becoming the way that we're able to get beyond our small little idolatrous world that we create, to see truth and goodness and beauty. Heschel says we do not possess it, but we may be possessed by it. When we perceive it, it is as if our mind were gliding for a while with an eternal current in which our ideas become knowledge swept beyond itself. This is the invitation that Jesus makes, not just for life, but for life abundant. As we come to the Lord's table, we come to this invitation to recalibrate our focus, which is why Jesus is going to take these elements and he's going to say, remember me. Part of the gift and the rhythm of taking the Lord's Supper together is to bring Jesus back to that place of focus and primacy in our lives. I thought I would give us 3 questions to sit with, and then we're going to go to the Lord's table. Number 1, what am I most afraid to lose right now? And what might that reveal about my ultimate concern? You've heard me say this before, but like, what am I clinging to that so often our whole posture is like, God, you can have it all. And he's like, what's that thing, Jeff? And I'm like, don't worry about that thing. You can have it all. And he's saying, you can keep all of that. What's this, right? Number 2, when I become anxious, defensive, angry, or reactive, what am I trying to protect? Maybe you think back on this week and you're like, oh, I regret that conversation. I regret the way I handled that. And to go, let that be an invitation. What is it underneath that I'm clutching to and trying to protect? And number 3, what would it look like this week to hold one important part of my life with a more open hand and entrust it more fully to God?